picture the scenario, because I guarantee it has happened to you within the last month.
Oh, without doubt.
You've just walked out of a suffocatingly long strategy meeting. Or maybe you finally hung up the phone after an absolutely grueling holiday planning conversation with a relative.
The classic holiday logistics nightmare.
Right. And you just slump into your chair, you rub your temples, and this very specific quiet question bubbles up in your mind. Like, am I literally surrounded by idiots?
It's an almost universally shared human experience. You're sitting there completely baffled, running the tape back in your head.
Yeah, just replaying the whole thing.
Exactly. And you're genuinely wondering how the person across from you manages to navigate the basic complexities of daily life.
Like operating a microwave.
Right. Or crossing the street without supervision.
Yeah, because in your mind, you explain the situation perfectly.
You laid out all the logic.
Point by point, the roadmap was crystal clear. And the other person just stared back at you with this blank expression. Or, well, worse, they reacted in a way that felt so entirely disconnected from the reality of the conversation that, your brain's only logical failsafe is to categorize them as functionally dense.
And we lean into that categorization because it's an incredibly efficient mental shortcut.
Oh, totally.
Labeling someone a fool kind of absolves you of the heavy cognitive lifting required to bridge that communication gap.
Right. If they're the idiot, it's not my fault.
Exactly. If they're an idiot, the failure is entirely on them. Your ego is completely protected.
But protecting our egos is exactly what traps us in this cycle of endless frustration.
It really is.
And breaking out of that cycle is our primary mission for this deep dive today. We are opening up a rather provocative piece of source material.
Very provocative.
Yeah, it's Thomas Erikson's runaway bestseller, Surrounded by Idiots. And we are going to completely deconstruct this concept of, idiocy.
By examining the DISC system of behavioral profiling.
Exactly, which Erikson categorizes into 4 distinct color profiles. You've got red, yellow, green, and blue.
And the goal here is really a total paradigm shift. We're going to look at how to reframe what feels like blatant incompetence into a highly predictable mechanical mismatch in communication styles.
Right. It's not incompetence, it's just a mismatch.
Yes. And we're going to introduce a psychological concept called the listener's reference frame, which fundamentally changes the rules of engagement.
I love that concept. And to make this hyper-practical for your listening, we're going to eventually run a stress test scenario.
Oh, the clash.
Yes. We're going to force a fiery, aggressive red personality into a room with a passive, harmony-seeking green personality and map exactly why that collaboration usually explodes.
And, crucially, outline the precise psychological levers you can pull to resolve it.
Because the stakes for this actually feel much higher than just, getting along at the office water cooler. We are communicating at a volume today that no previous generation has ever experienced.
That is the crucial context here. Just think about your average Tuesday.
Oh, it's exhausting.
Right. You're navigating Slack threads. You're rapidly interpreting the tone of brief emails.
Jumping on video calls where you only see two-dimensional faces.
And fielding text messages all at once.
Yeah.
The sheer bandwidth of human interaction is just staggering.
It's too much.
It is. Yet the biological hardware we use to process these interactions hasn't had a major update in roughly 200,000 years.
Wow. Put it that way, it's a miracle we communicate at all.
Truly. We rely heavily on assumptions. And when those assumptions fail, we assume malice or stupidity.
Yeah.
But understanding the cognitive mechanics behind why a colleague processes information differently doesn't just lower your blood pressure. It's literally the master key to unlocking leverage in your career and your relationships.
Well, let's ground this right away with a story from the source text that perfectly encapsulates the sheer collateral damage of lacking that master key.
The story of Scenario.
Yes, sure. Erikson introduces us to this man named Stor. He's a 60-year-old self-employed entrepreneur, built a respectable company from the ground up, knows his industry inside and out.
A classic self-made man.
Exactly. And when the author sits down to interview him for a consulting project, Stor casually drops a bombshell. He leans over his desk and states, with absolute sincerity, that his entire company is staffed by complete and utter idiots.
And what is fascinating about Stor isn't the complaint itself.
Right.
Bosses complain about employees all the time.
Sure.
It's the depth of his conviction. He is operating under a severe psychological phenomenon known as the false consensus effect.
Well, he certainly wasn't keeping it a secret. He walks the author through the organization. He says, Department A is full of morons.
Right.
Department B is staffed by clowns who can't grasp basic concepts. And Department C, he says they are so bizarre, he legitimately doesn't understand how they find their way to the office building in the morning.
It's just sweeping generalizations.
And he didn't reserve these critiques for private consulting sessions. He actively called his employees idiots to their faces in front of their peers.
Which creates an immediate culture of fear.
Obviously.
And systemic paralysis. Because in a behavioral ecosystem like that, survival dictates invisibility.
You just keep your head down.
Exactly. You never bring that kind of leader bad news, which means the leader becomes increasingly isolated from the reality of their own business.
But the detail that elevated Studer from just a standard bad boss to a fascinating psychological case study was the physical hardware he installed at his primary office.
This part is unbelievable.
Listen to this. Studer actually had a literal physical warning light mounted discreetly above the reception desk at the main entrance.
A literal light.
A literal light. When Studer was physically present in the building, the light glowed red. When he was out of the office, the receptionist switched the light to green.
It's an almost cartoonish manifestation of environmental control.
Like a supervillain.
Yeah. A literal traffic light dictating the emotional weather of the entire company.
And everyone knew what the light meant. It wasn't just some internal staff secret. Clients learned about it.
Oh, wow.
The text notes that clients would walk through the front doors immediately cast a nervous glance up at the wall. And if they saw that red light glaring back at them, some of them would literally spin on their heels, walk back out to their cars, and decide to spend their money on a day when the boss wasn't around to terrorize them.
That is wild.
Think about the catastrophic financial hemorrhage happening there simply because one man couldn't modulate his communication style.
Well, that physical light is a perfect externalization of internal threat detection. Our brains are constantly scanning for social threats.
Right.
When Studer's light was red, it spiked cortisol levels across the entire office before anyone even spoke a word. But, the ultimate irony here is the blind spot.
Oh, the blind spot was massive.
Yeah.
So the author, who was quite young and perhaps a bit reckless at the time, listens to Studer rant for an hour.
Setting himself up.
Finally, he looks at Studer and asks the single most dangerous, logical question possible. He asks, who hired all these idiots?
An incredibly precise strike at the ego.
Because Studer was the founder, he hired almost all of them himself.
Right.
The implicit question hanging in the air was, if you are the one who actively recruited, interviewed, and hired a building full of fools, who is the actual idiot in this room?
And Studer understood the subtext immediately.
Oh, he went crimson. Threw the author out of his office. Erikson actually later heard through the grapevine that Studer genuinely wanted to retrieve a shotgun and handle the situation lethally.
Which is terrifying. But we have to unpack the cognitive distortion happening in Studer's mind, because it's the baseline for why this entire behavioral system exists.
Let's deal.
Studer was projecting his own internal operating system onto the rest of the world. He assumed his pace, his priority for directness, and his specific analytical framework were the objective default for the human species.
Like everyone should just be exactly like him.
Therefore, any deviation from his specific behavioral algorithm was categorized as a defect.
So it wasn't that his employees were actually incompetent, they were just playing a different instrument, and Studer only recognized the sound of a drum.
Precisely. And this is where the history of behavior profiling provides such crucial context.
Yeah.
We tend to view personality assessments as modern corporate HR inventions, but humanity has been desperately trying to codify these behavioral deviations for millennia.
Which brings us to the foreword of the book, written by David Bonstetter. He's the CEO of a behavioral assessment company, but the origin story he shares is so wildly removed from a sterile corporate boardroom.
It takes place in rural Iowa, right?
Yes, rural Iowa. His father, Bill Bonstetter, was attempting to optimize agricultural sales by applying the behavioral theories of a man named William Moulton Marston to literal Doot farmers.
And this is a brilliant collision of high academic theory and raw observable reality, taking psychological matrices and testing them against crop yields and tractor purchases.
Exactly. David describes sitting at a knotty pine kitchen table, eating roost corn and pork tenderloins, while his dad laid out this grand theory. Bill believed he could accurately predict a farmer's entire behavioral profile, their risk tolerance, and exactly how a salesperson should speak to them purely by observing the physical layout of their farm from the road.
Because behavior leaves physical artifacts.
Okay, but wait, let me pressure test that idea because it sounds a bit like corporate astrology.
You get that?
Just looking at a driveway tells you a personality.
Well, his logic was very specific.
Yeah, he noted that if a farm had a pristine driveway, meticulously neat groves, and perfectly maintained classic equipment, the farmer operating it was a blue, meaning highly analytical, cautious, and detail-oriented.
Right.
Conversely, if a farm had brand new, highly experimental livestock setups, massive new buildings, and maybe some machinery scattered around mid-project, you were looking at a red, a dominant, risk-taking, fast-moving pioneer.
It's not astrology at all. It is environmental psychology. And if we look at the lineage of this thought process, Bill Bonstetter was standing on the shoulders of giants.
Who else was looking at this?
Hippocrates, the ancient Greek physician, recognized these exact same 4 distinct patterns and attributed them to bodily fluids, choleric, sanguine, phlegmatic, and melancholic.
Wow.
Even the Aztecs mapped these exact same 4 temperaments onto the elements of fire, air, earth, and water.
So this framework of 4 dominant human operating systems isn't a new trend at all. We've been circling this exact same drain for thousands of years.
Yes, and it was William Moulton Marston in the 1920s who formalized it into the DISC model. Marston is a fascinating figure, by the way. He invented the systolic blood pressure test.
Oh, which became the modern polygraph, right?
Exactly. And he also created the comic book character Wonder Woman.
That is a crazy resume.
Right. His entire life's work was dedicated to understanding truth, emotional expression, and how human beings respond to their environment. He categorized our behavioral responses into dominance, inducement, submission, and compliance, which Erikson adapts slightly in the text to analytic ability.
Let me build an analogy here, going back to structure's physical red and green warning light.
Okay.
What Erikson is arguing, and what Marston codified, is that every single one of us has a warning light. It just isn't mounted above a reception desk.
Right. It's an internal neurological threat detector.
Yes. If I'm a highly cautious, data-driven person, and you walk into my office talking a mile a minute about a vague, risky new idea without any spreadsheets to back it up.
My internal warning light flashes blindingly red.
Exactly. My cognitive defenses slam shut. I don't hear your idea. I just perceive you as a chaotic threat.
That is a phenomenal way to visualize it. When you encounter someone operating on a different behavioral axis, your brain registers the friction as a threat to your equilibrium. And that internal red light fundamentally blocks communication, which brings us to the most uncomfortable, ego-bruising concept in the entire source text.
Oh, the listener's reference frame.
This concept requires a complete rewiring of how most people view interaction. The foundational law of this system is this: communication usually takes place on the recipient's terms.
I want to make sure I'm parsing that correctly. It takes place on the recipient's terms, meaning the speaker's intent is effectively irrelevant?
From a purely functional standpoint, yes.
Wow.
Let's say you drop a complex, nuanced joke during a tense project meeting. Your internal intention is positive, right? You want to break the ice, lower the collective cortisol, and build camaraderie.
Right, I'm trying to help.
But if your colleague's perception filter is tuned to a frequency that values severe professionalism and strict adherence to the agenda, they don't perceive camaraderie.
What do they see?
They perceive you as flippant, disrespectful of their time, and entirely oblivious to the project's stakes.
So my reality, that I was being helpful, doesn't matter at all. Their perception becomes the objective reality of that interaction.
Exactly. You cannot force your communication style onto another human being and demand that they automatically decode your good intentions.
Ooh.
If you want your idea to survive the journey from your brain into their brain, you have to broadcast on a frequency that their receiver is biologically and psychologically tuned to accept.
That is incredibly difficult to swallow. When a miscommunication happens, our immediate visceral reaction is to defend our intent, like, you're taking this out of context, or that isn't what I meant at all.
Yeah, we've all been there.
It feels deeply unfair that I have to cater to someone else's misinterpretation.
It is an absolute assault on the ego. And Erikson makes a brilliant observation about how the ego operates differently across these 4 color profiles, particularly regarding self-awareness and the evaluation of personal strengths and weaknesses.
Oh, the spectrum of self-delusion here is vast.
It really is. The text splits the colors into 2 overarching groups when it comes to self-evaluation. You have the active extroverts, the reds and the yellows, And the reflective introverts, the greens and the blues.
And they evaluate their own competence in completely opposite ways.
Let's start with the active extroverts. How do they view the person in the mirror?
Through rose-colored, highly magnified glasses, reds and yellows have a pronounced tendency to vastly inflate their strengths. They possess incredibly robust egos.
Almost to a fault.
In fact, Erikson notes that they often genuinely struggle to identify any significant weaknesses in themselves. They don't dwell on past mistakes. They view themselves as inherently capable problem solvers.
Give an example.
Well, if a yellow profile drops the ball and completely forgets a vital detail for a client presentation, they employ what the author calls selective memory.
How convenient.
Right. They instantly forgive themselves, focus on the charming joke they made during the intro, and walk away believing they nailed it.
And, we shouldn't dismiss that as purely arrogant. From an evolutionary standpoint, that dopamine-driven optimism is a highly adaptive survival mechanism.
How so?
It allows pioneers to endure massive failure without losing the will to keep pushing boundaries. But it also creates a massive blind spot regarding their impact on others.
Okay, then you flip the coin and look at the reflective introverts, the greens and the blues. Their self-evaluation process is a masterclass in negativity bias.
They turn the microscope inward, and they only look for flaws.
Precisely. Erikson states that greens and blues consistently exaggerate their weaknesses and, in many cases, entirely ignore or invalidate their own strengths.
It's sad, really.
You could walk up to a green or a blue, hand them an award, and give them glowing, data-backed, positive feedback about a project they just completed.
And their cognitive filter will immediately reject it.
They will literally deflect the compliment and steer the conversation toward a minor error. They'll say, well, the rollout was okay, but I noticed a typo on slide 42, so the whole presentation was sloppy. They are fixated on mitigating risk and error to the point where they cannot absorb their own success.
This disparity in self-perception raises a critical point about the definition of self-awareness. True self-awareness isn't just reciting a list of your skills.
What is it then?
It is the metacognitive ability to recognize that a trait that makes you incredibly valuable in one specific environment, say, a red's ability to make ruthless, split-second decisions during a crisis, makes you an absolute terror to work with when the environment requires careful consensus and empathy.
Your superpower is entirely context-dependent,
Yes.
meaning your greatest strength is also the exact reason someone else considers you an idiot.
Exactly. So the ultimate utility of this deep dive is adaptation. If you want to start feeling surrounded by fools, you have to learn to identify the structural framework of the person in front of you, suppress your own ego's desire to communicate natively, and deliberately step into their reference frame.
Okay, to actually execute that, we need to map the territory. We need to understand the structural mechanics of these four colors. Let's start by mapping the active extroverted side of Marston's matrix.
The fast-paced ones.
Right. If we imagine an XY axis, these are the profiles sitting high on the pace axis. They move fast. First up, the red profile. Dominance.
The apex predators of the behavioral ecosystem.
I mean, when you visualize a red, imagine a high-performance sports car with a brick resting on the accelerator and the brake lines entirely severed.
That's a terrifying image.
The source text describes them as ambitious, aggressive, strong-willed, and singularly task-oriented. They are the people who run into burning buildings to solve the problem while everyone else is still forming a committee to discuss water pressure.
Right.
But their defining characteristic is their relationship with time. To a red, speed is the only valid metric of efficiency.
That is the core cognitive driver. If a process is slow, it is inherently flawed.
And their verbal communication reflects that need for velocity. They don't use collaborative language, they use declarative I messages.
No we in team for them.
Nope, they don't say, what do we think about this proposal? They say, I am taking this assignment, or we are executing my strategy. They aren't seeking your approval, they are informing you of the new reality.
Which, if you are a consensus-driven person, feels like a physical assault. It feels dictatorial.
It feels incredibly rude. The author shares an anecdote about a deeply read individual named Bjorn that left me completely stunned. It illustrates the jarring nature of this communication style perfectly.
Oh, the sick daughter story.
Yes. So the author is chatting with Bjorn, and Bjorn unexpectedly asks how the author's sick daughter is doing.
Which is a standard socially empathetic script. It suggests a desire for human connection.
Exactly. So the author relaxes, opens up, and replies that the daughter's doing much better, the fever broke, everything is fine. The moment Bjorn hears the words, she's fine, he instantly, without missing a single beat, changes the subject entirely back to the business at hand.
Wow.
He didn't offer a follow-up, he didn't express relief, he just dropped it like a hot stone.
Now, if you judge that through a conventional social lens, Bjorn appears clinically devoid of empathy. He looks like a sociopath faking human interest.
That was my exact thought when reading it. Like, what is wrong with this guy?
But Erikson jumps in to clarify the mechanics here.
Yeah.
Bjorn isn't a sociopath. He isn't heartless. But his brain is wired for problem solving and cognitive closure.
Okay.
He identified a potential problem, a sick child. He inquired about the status of the problem. He received data confirming the problem was resolved. Therefore, allocating any further cognitive energy or time to discussing a solved problem is inefficient.
So he just shuts it down.
He literally closed the communication channel because the data transfer was complete.
That is the listener's reference frame in its purest form. If you demand that Bjorn perform the emotional theater of prolonged small talk, you are the one creating friction. You have to strip away your emotional interpretation of his brevity. His intent isn't malice, it's momentum. So, practically speaking, if I am forced to pitch an idea to a deeply read boss or client, how do I avoid triggering their internal warning light?
You practice radical brevity. You strip your communication of all decorative elements. Do not bring a 50-page slide deck with deep background history.
They'll hate that.
They'll throw it out. A read wants the conclusion first, the cost second, and the timeline third. If you can fit the pitch on the back of a napkin, do it. But you must have an ironclad grasp of the facts, because if they spot a logical flaw, they will interrogate you ruthlessly.
And the text makes a massive point about social boundaries here. Whatever
Yeah.
you do, do not attempt to be their buddy.
No small talk.
If you walk into a Reds office for a first meeting, do not comment on the photos on their desk. Do not ask how their weekend golf game went. They view attempts at personal ingratiation as either a sign of professional weakness or a manipulative tactic. They respect competence, not charm.
Think of it as a surgical strike.
Yeah.
Get in, deliver the payload of information, and get out.
All right, so that is the red frequency. Fast-paced, task-focused, ruthless efficiency. Let's slide over to the other active extrovert. The high-pace but high people-focused profile. The yellow. Inducement.
If the red profile is a surgical strike, the yellow profile is a fireworks display.
I love that. Yellows are the lifeblood of social energy. They are enthusiastic, highly creative, fiercely optimistic, and entirely relationship-oriented.
Who are we talking about here?
To give us a mental anchor, Erikson points to figures like Robin Williams, Ellen DeGeneres, or Han Solo.
Individuals who command a room not through intimidation, but through gravitational charm.
Yes, they survive and thrive on social connectivity. A yellow profile doesn't have acquaintances. Everyone they meet is instantly categorized as a friend.
It sounds great, honestly.
It does, but there is a massive shadow side to this effervescent charm. Because they are so entirely focused on the big picture and the emotional temperature of the room, they possess an allergy to details. And crucially, they are notoriously terrible listeners.
Let's explore the neuroscience of why that is. It isn't that their ears don't work. It's that their working memory is entirely hijacked by their own verbal processing. Yellows utilize external verbalization as their primary cognitive tool.
Meaning?
They literally think by speaking.
Which means, while you are talking to them, they aren't actually absorbing your words. They are just waiting for the microsecond you pause to breathe so they can launch their next thought.
Yes.
The text provides a jaw-dropping statistical example of this. Erikson is observing a corporate management meeting with a stopwatch. There's a CEO, 7 associates, and an agenda with 19 distinct items. There's a yellow sales manager in the room named Peter. Peter's department is responsible for exactly one of those 19 items.
So mathematically, he should own about, 5% of the meeting's bandwidth?
Peter spoke for 69% of the entire meeting.
Oh my God.
He dominated over 2/3 of the oxygen in the room. He had a passionate, lengthy opinion on logistics, on HR, on accounting topics he objectively knew nothing about. He simply could not tolerate silence, and he felt compelled to verbally inject himself into every single dynamic.
And this leads to another classic yellow archetype mentioned in the text, the hijacker.
Oh, Gustav. The story of Gustav gave me secondhand anxiety.
It's painful to read.
Erikson was leading a large, multi-day conference. Gustav, a profoundly yellow attendee, effectively took the entire conference hostage. Whenever Erikson posed a theoretical question to the room, Gustav answered immediately. He didn't pause to formulate a thesis. He just opened his mouth and let a stream of consciousness fall out.
Just verbal processing in real time.
It got so bad that Erikson started specifically pointing at other attendees and asking them by name to answer.
Let me guess. Gustav answered for them.
Gustav would literally physically lean across the table, insert his face into the line of sight of the person being asked, and answer the question on their behalf.
That's infuriating.
He lacked the fundamental self-awareness to realize he was acting as a verbal steamroller. Everyone in the room despised him by lunch, but because greens and blues hate conflict, no one stopped him. Erikson finally had to pull him aside during a coffee break and stage a blunt intervention just to salvage the afternoon session.
Again, we have to apply the listener's reference frame. Gustav wasn't trying to sabotage the conference. In his mind, he was being the ultimate team player.
Yeah.
He was demonstrating high engagement. He was providing energy to the room.
So how do you manage that energy without crushing their spirit? Because you can't just hand a thick technical manual and tell them to read it quietly at their desk.
Oh, if you hand a yellow a manual, it becomes a coaster for their coffee mug within 5 minutes.
Huh, true.
To capture and hold a yellow's attention, you have to operate in broad strokes. Paint the grand vision. Start with the why, not the how. And the environmental mood is paramount.
How so?
Yellows are incredibly sensitive to ambient tension. If you bring a stern red-style aggression into a meeting with a yellow, they will either emotionally shut down or their anxiety will cause them to talk even more erratically. You have to maintain a warm, open, almost playful atmosphere.
The text actually offers a piece of advice here that feels a bit patronizing, but I want to unpack it. It says that because yellows struggle so immensely with initiating boring, detail-oriented tasks, you sometimes have to treat them slightly like children.
It sounds harsh.
You have to gently push them, but you can never let them feel like they are being controlled.
It sounds patronizing until you view it through the lens of motivation. A red is motivated by achievement. A blue is motivated by accuracy. A yellow is motivated by social validation and freedom.
Okay, that makes sense.
If you impose strict draconian rules on a yellow, you crush their creative dopamine. You have to frame the boring task like filing their expense reports as something that will increase their social standing or free them up to do the fun, visionary work they crave.
Before we move on to the introverts, I have to step back and play devil's advocate for a second.
Go for it.
When I read these descriptions sequentially, my immediate reaction was highly critical. I thought, are reds just fundamentally abusive sociopaths? And are yellows just clinical, self-obsessed narcissists?
It is a very natural reflex to pathologize behavior that irritates us. But the entire premise of the DISC framework is removing that moral judgment.
So we have to separate the impact of the behavior from the intent of the behavior. Reds aren't trying to be cruel. They simply operate in a reality where time is a finite, depreciating asset, and pleasantries are a waste of that asset. And yellows aren't trying to suck all the air out of the room out of sheer vanity. They rely on external verbalization and group connection as their literal mechanism for processing the world.
Exactly. They're just running different operating systems. Which brings us perfectly to the other side of Marston's matrix.
The lower half.
Right. If reds and yellows are defined by their fast pace and their desire to actively manipulate their environment, what happens when we drop the pace, cross the axis, and look at the profiles that prefer to react to and stabilize their environment?
The reflective introverts. The greens and the blues. Let's start with the greens. Submission or stability. The text points out that this is statistically the most common profile you will encounter. If society were a recipe, greens are the flour. Erikson describes them as the average of all the other extremes.
Hippocrates labeled them phlegmatic. The Aztecs mapped them to the element of earth.
Earth is the perfect metaphor. They are grounded, they are incredibly calm, highly relationship-oriented, easygoing, but fundamentally passive.
The peacekeepers.
They are the glue that holds communities and families together because they genuinely prioritize the well-being of the group over their own individual ego. But their central, defining psychological struggle is their deep, abiding terror of conflict and change.
We need to explore the neurology of that fear. For a green, social harmony equals survival. Any disruption to the status quo, even a positive change, registers in their amygdala as a threat to the tribe's cohesion.
And therefore a threat to their own safety.
Exactly.
The text provides a brilliant hypothetical stress test to illustrate how differently the colors react to sudden environmental threat. Imagine a company announces out of nowhere that a massive recession has hit their sector, profits are down, and management is entirely restructuring the organization immediately.
A classic trigger for organizational chaos.
Exactly. So, how do the active colors react? The reds, who haven't even finished reading the memo, immediately storm out of their offices, barking orders, demanding action, while barging into the CEO's office to argue action at all costs.
And the yellows.
The yellows immediately form clusters in the hallway, engaging in wild emotional speculation, talking over each other, spinning elaborate narratives about what this all means without doing any actual work.
Typical. And what about the reflective colors?
The blues retreat silently to their cubicles, open up massive spreadsheets, and begin drafting a list of 150 highly technical questions about severance packages and budget deficits that absolutely no one has the answers to yet.
And the greens.
The greens just freeze.
The classic freeze response in the face of a predator.
They panic internally. They don't fight like the reds, they don't verbalize like the yellows, and they don't analyze like the blues. They just desperately want someone to tell them that everything will go back to the way it was yesterday.
Total paralysis.
They become paralyzed by indecision. And Erikson notes that this specific brand of passive indecision acts like a wet blanket, suffocating the kinetic energy of the other profiles.
Because a green's primary objective is avoiding the spotlight of conflict, they exhibit a very specific behavioral mechanism when they feel they are the cause of disharmony.
Yes, the text calls it total appeasement. Reading this section was almost uncomfortable because of how raw and vulnerable it is.
It's hard to watch.
When a green is criticized or when they make a mistake that upsets someone, they don't defend themselves. They completely collapse. They prostrate themselves emotionally. They will say, "You're absolutely right. I am so completely stupid. I can't believe I did that. I'm a failure."
From a psychological standpoint, this is the fawn response. They are preemptively attacking themselves to diffuse the aggressor's anger and restore the social bond.
But the irony is that it drives the task-oriented profiles absolutely insane. If a red or a blue points out a factual error on a report, they just want the number fixed.
Right. It's not personal.
When the green collapses into a puddle of self-flagellation and spends the next 3 weeks awkwardly apologizing every time they pass in the hallway, the red feels manipulated and the blue is just confused by the emotional theater.
Which is why interacting with a green is like handling non-Newtonian fluid.
Oh, wait, elaborate on that. That's a fascinating analogy.
Think of cornstarch mixed with water. If you strike it hard and fast like a red communicating, the fluid seizes up, turns solid, and acts as an impenetrable barrier. The green freezes and resists.
That makes total sense.
But if you move your hand into it slowly, gently, and with consistent pressure, the fluid yields entirely, and you can mold it however you need. To communicate effectively with a green, you have to bypass their threat detection system by validating the relationship first.
Validate the relationship before assigning the task. That is a massive takeaway. Great, let's look at the final quadrant of the matrix. The slow-paced, highly task-oriented profile, the blue, analytic ability or compliance.
The quintessential knights of the Excel spreadsheet.
I'm stealing that phrase forever. The blues are the systemic thinkers. They are conscientious, incredibly detail-oriented, distant, and driven entirely by facts, logic, and quality control.
If the red is the accelerator of the organizational vehicle, the blue is the emergency brake.
They are the ultimate critical thinkers. But Erikson warns that because they require absolute data certainty before making a decision, their critical thinking can very easily curdle into deep suspicion and pessimism.
They view the unbridled optimism of a yellow or the reckless speed of a red as functionally dangerous. To a blue, risk is everywhere, and data is the only shield.
And their requirement for boundaries, both physical and psychological, is absolute. A yellow will tell you about their childhood trauma within 5 minutes of sitting next to you on a bus.
Unsolicited.
Exactly. But the text says you could sit in a cubicle next to a blue for 3 solid months, work on projects together every single day, and it is still a violation of protocol to ask them the name of their dog. They compartmentalize their professional and personal lives with blast doors.
They require massive amounts of cognitive space to process their internal data. External social demands interrupt that processing.
The author shares this phenomenal, almost comedic anecdote about a blue woman that perfectly highlights the gap between how a blue views their own logic and how the rest of the world perceives their rigidity.
The shoe matrix.
The shoe matrix. So Erikson is running a workshop explaining the blue profile's tendency toward extreme perfectionism. And this woman in the front row vigorously objects. She says, That isn't me at all. I am absolutely not a perfectionist. In fact, my house is constantly untidy.
Which, to a blue, is the ultimate defense. If I have a flaw, I cannot be a perfectionist.
Exactly. So Erikson presses her for an example of this supposed untidiness. She explains that she has 3 children, and they often have friends over after school. When she gets home from work, the entryway is a chaotic mess of discarded shoes. She says she literally has to high jump over the pile just to get into her own house.
Okay, to be fair, a pile of shoes is a mess.
But listen to her process for dealing with the mess. First, she meticulously shakes the dirt off the doormat outside. Then she brings the shoes inside and begins arranging them. But she doesn't just line them up. She confides to the room that she takes the size 10 shoes, the ones belonging to the older kids who stay the longest, and places them in a perfectly neat row at the very back of the mat. Then she arrays the smaller sizes in descending order, moving toward the front door, based on the statistical probability of when each child will leave the house.
That is staggering. That is applying warehouse logistics algorithms to a mudroom.
But wait, the procedure isn't finished. After the shoe matrix is complete, she walks into the kitchen. The kids have been making sandwiches, so there are crumbs on the counter. She describes it as a biological war zone.
Crumbs.
Crumbs. Before she can even take off her coat, she spends exactly 20 uninterrupted minutes sweeping, sanitizing worktops, and meticulously wiping down every surface. Only after the shoes are sorted by departure time and the kitchen is surgically sterilized can she finally remove her outerwear and breathe.
And in her mind, because the shoes were in a pile when she arrived, she wasn't a perfectionist. She was just doing the bare minimum to restore order.
The rest of the workshop attendees were in tears, laughing at her lack of self-awareness. She looked around the room, completely bewildered as to why her highly logical shoe-sorting algorithm was funny.
That's incredible.
The incredible footnote to the story is that Erikson ran into this exact same woman years later. She approached him and admitted that his behavior analysis was 100% accurate.
Let me guess how she figured it out.
Yeah.
She tracked the data.
Yes.
Of course.
She had kept the behavioral checklists from the workshop folded up in her purse for years. Every single time she caught herself exhibiting a blue trait, she formally ticked a box with a pen. It took years, but she gathered enough empirical data on her own life to systematically check off every single box on the list, ultimately proving the hypothesis.
That is the most fundamentally blue methodology for achieving self-awareness imaginable.
It's beautiful in its consistency. But looking at these 4 profiles, if I'm a business owner, I might look at greens, who freeze in terror at the slightest change, and blues, who demand years of data before making a move and think, why would I hire them? I just want a team of reds and yellows to conquer the market.
That is a common and fatal leadership mistake. You have to view these profiles as an interconnected ecosystem.
Why?
Because if you build an executive team entirely out of reds and yellows, you don't get a powerhouse. You get flaming wreckage.
Yeah.
You have massive velocity, huge ideas, zero quality control, and everyone is fighting for the steering wheel while the engine burns out.
So the introverts are the structural integrity of the system.
Precisely. Greens are the necessary friction that forces the team to consider the human element. They ensure that in the rush for profits, you don't burn out your workforce. They maintain the culture.
And the blues.
The blues are the only ones reading the terms and conditions. When the red demands the product launch tomorrow and the yellow is already spending the bonus money on a victory party, the blue is the solitary figure pointing out that the product's internal battery occasionally catches fire. You need the brakes just as much as you need the engine.
Okay, we have thoroughly mapped the territory. We understand the isolated variables. We have the dominant, fast-paced reds, the charming, chaotic yellows, the passive, loyal greens, and the analytical, cautious blues. Now, let's see what happens when we mix the chemicals.
This is where the listener's reference frame becomes a survival tool.
This is the exact scenario promised at the top of the deep dive. We are going to examine the red versus green clash.
This is perhaps the most frequent point of friction in any corporate hierarchy, because reds tend to gravitate toward management, and greens make up the bulk of the execution force.
Let's set the scene. Management has forced a deeply red employee and a deeply green employee to collaborate on a critical, time-sensitive project. Neither of them has read Erikson's book. Neither possesses an ounce of behavioral self-awareness. How does this detonate?
It detonates almost instantly because their baseline assumptions about how work should be approached are diametrically opposed.
Let's jump into the red's perspective first.
Mhm.
The red receives the assignment and immediately shifts into overdrive. They probably haven't even finished reading the project brief. They just know action is required.
Right.
They look across the desk at the green, who is quietly rereading the instructions, and the red instantly categorizes the green as a sluggish, passive obstacle.
Because the green is prioritizing understanding over speed, the red's internal warning light flashes. The red perceives caution as incompetence or laziness.
And a red's patience threshold is effectively 0. The text uses a fascinating metaphor for this. If you compare emotional temperaments to drinking vessels, a red's capacity for anger is a shot glass.
It is incredibly small, it fills up with frustration instantly, and it spills over aggressively.
Boom! The red snaps. They bark in order, they criticize the green's lack of initiative, and they aggressively trample all over the green's boundaries to seize control of the project.
And that's just the red side.
Exactly. Now, let's switch cameras and look at this exact same moment from the green's perspective.
The green's reality is entirely different.
The green is sitting there feeling overwhelmed by the sudden mandate. They value stability. They might tentatively ask a process question like, how are we going to delegate this so everyone is comfortable? We have a few weeks, right?
Which is a highly logical question for someone trying to mitigate social risk and ensure stability.
But to the red, that question sounds like fingernails on a chalkboard. The red erupts. And the green, watching this shot glass anger overflow, suddenly views the red as an unstable, cantankerous bully. A tyrant who refuses to listen and simply wants to dominate the space.
You have a total catastrophic breakdown in communication. The red thinks the green is an idiot for moving too slowly. The green thinks the red is an idiot for behaving like a sociopath. And the project dies on the vine.
So how do we perform CPR on this dynamic? How do we practically apply the listener's reference frame to fix this?
What's deeply ironic is that, according to Marston's framework, this pairing actually possesses a profound inherent logic. If navigated correctly, red and green are highly complementary.
Wait, really? They seem like antimatter and matter. They should annihilate each other.
They are opposites, but their core drives fit together like a lock and key. Think about it. A red's primary desire is to take command, establish direction, and give orders. A green's primary desire is to avoid the burden of leadership, maintain harmony, and they are generally perfectly happy to follow clear orders, provided those orders don't threaten their security.
Ah, so you don't have the ego clash. If you put two reds in a room, it's a death match for the steering wheel. But the green voluntarily gets in the passenger seat.
Exactly. The mechanical fit is perfect. The failure is entirely in the delivery of the communication. And the responsibility for bridging that gap always falls to the person who wants to drive the action, in this case, the red. The red must consciously choose to broadcast on the green's frequency.
They have to bypass the green's amygdala. They have to prevent the freeze and fawn response.
Precisely. If the red brings their default shot glass anger to the table, the green will immediately collapse into total appeasement. They will apologize, shut down, and productivity drops to 0. To get the efficiency the red desperately craves, the red must deliberately slow their physical and verbal pace.
The text suggests a very specific physical and verbal strategy. It recommends that the red approach the green with softer body language, maybe even a brief hand on the shoulder, if appropriate, to physically signal social safety.
Lower the threat level.
Right. And the directive needs to be embedded in reassurance. Instead of barking, have this done by noon, the red needs to say something like, hey, we're a great team. I really value your work on this. I know this is a tight turnaround, but I need your help to get this section finished by noon so we stay on track.
Let's dissect why that works. By affirming the relationship, saying, we're a great team, and asking for cooperation, I need your help. The red completely neutralizes the green's fear of conflict.
Because the relationship is safe.
The green feels secure in the social bond. Once that threat is removed, the green's natural loyalty and diligence activate, and they will happily and efficiently execute the task. The red gets their speed, and the green keeps their peace. That is the listener's reference frame, executing flawlessly.
That is a masterclass in behavioral leverage. But I have to say, as fascinating as the red and green dynamic is, there is a pairing mentioned in the text that feels even more combustible. It's the diagonal clash on Marston's matrix.
Yes, the ultimate disaster combination, yellow versus blue.
It is the absolute perfect storm of cognitive dissonance. Imagine management pairs up the human party balloon with the Excel knight.
It is a recipe for mutual psychological torture.
The author describes this collision so vividly. They are assigned a joint task. The yellow, driven by unbridled enthusiasm, dives in immediately without having any clue what the parameters are.
Typical yellow.
They haven't read the brief, they don't know the budget, they just start pacing the room, talking at a staggering volume about how disruptive this project will be, how it's going to change the industry, and how famous they are all going to be.
They are processing externally. And the blue.
The blue has silently gathered every single piece of documentation available. They have seated themselves at the desk. They haven't made eye contact. They haven't spoken a single syllable. They are completely motionless, reading the fine print, searching for the hidden risks in paragraph 4.
The chasm between their perception filters is monumental.
The yellow stops pacing, looks over at the blue, who essentially resembles a statue reading a textbook, and thinks, "This person is a black hole of energy. This is the most uninspiring, soul-crushing bore I have ever encountered. They're going to drag my genius down."
Meanwhile, the blue, whose cognitive processing requires absolute silence, is listening to the yellow's incessant, fact-free buzzing.
And what's the blue thinking?
The blue's internal monologue is brutal. The blue concludes that the yellow is a frivolous, incompetent windbag who is actively endangering the project with their sheer lack of rigor.
And here is where the tragedy compounds itself. Because the yellow is fundamentally driven by a need for social validation, they can sense that they are losing the blue. They can feel the coldness. So what is their biological reflex?
They turn the volume.
They pull out all the stops. They try to charm the blue. They start making jokes, asking personal questions, trying to force a social bond, which is literally the most aggressive, offensive thing you can do to a blue who is trying to concentrate on data.
It's the worst possible move.
Erikson says the inevitable conclusion is the two of them sitting in opposite corners of the room, faces drawn tight, absolutely furious at each other for completely different, mutually exclusive reasons.
It is the ultimate proof that good intentions are meaningless without behavioral translation. If you don't understand these underlying mechanics, you will spend your entire professional and personal life exhausted, confused, and deeply resentful of people who are quite literally incapable of processing the world the way you do.
So as we pull back and synthesize everything we've unpacked today in this deep dive into Surrounded by Idiots, I think the core takeaway requires us to permanently retire a specific phrase from our vocabulary.
The phrase that started this whole discussion.
Right. We aren't actually surrounded by idiots. When you walk out of that frustrating meeting or hang up that maddening phone call, you aren't dealing with fools trying to actively sabotage your existence. You are simply surrounded by reds, yellows, greens, and blues. You are interacting with biological systems that prioritize velocity over empathy, or social connection over accuracy, or stability over innovation, or flawless data over forward momentum.
And recognizing that diversity of thought isn't just an exercise in empathy. It is a strategic imperative. The master key to unlocking your influence, whether you're trying to close a massive corporate merger or just trying to get your family to agree on a restaurant without a screaming match, is robust self-awareness.
It all comes back to that.
It is the maturity to acknowledge your own default settings, recognize your inherent blind spots, and take on the cognitive burden of speaking to the listener entirely within their reference frame.
You have to forcibly turn off your own internal warning light long enough to decode what color is driving the person sitting across from you.
Absolutely. I would challenge everyone listening to us right now to turn this into an active exercise today. If you are commuting, look at the cars around you. At your next Zoom meeting or tonight around the dinner table, stop analyzing the content of what people are saying and start analyzing the structure of how they say it.
Oh, that's a great exercise.
Notice who uses declarative I statements and constantly tries to accelerate the timeline. Notice who cannot tolerate silence and verbally processes their thoughts out loud. Notice who physically shrinks into their posture the exact second a debate gets heated. And notice who demands hyper-specific details and deflects personal questions.
It's like seeing the code in the Matrix. Once you tune your eyes to the 4 colors, you literally cannot unsee them. But before we wrap up, I want to leave you with one final, slightly provocative thought to chew on. Something that builds on Erikson's research, but flips the mirror back on us.
I'm always a fan of a lingering existential question.
The author drops a fascinating statistical reality near the end of the text. He notes that pure, unadulterated behavioral profiles are incredibly rare. Only about 5% of the global population is purely one solid color.
5%, that's tiny.
Right. Roughly 80% of us are a combination of 2 colors. Maybe you are a red-yellow or a blue-green.
Meaning our dominant behavioral expression is highly fluid and situational.
Exactly. You might be a deeply passive, harmony-seeking green when you are at home with your spouse, prioritizing peace above all else. But the second you walk through the doors of your office, you shift into a dominant, fast-paced red to drive your team to hit quotas. We are chameleons adapting to our environmental incentives.
That adaptability is our greatest evolutionary advantage.
But think about the logical conclusion of that adaptability. If our behavior change is based entirely on the room we are standing in, and if idiocy is simply defined as a mismatch in communication styles, does that mean that you are the idiot in someone else's story simply because you confidently walked into the wrong room and used the wrong color? If we all possess the capacity to shift gears, maybe the most foolish, idiotic move of all is sitting rigidly in your own reality, assuming the rest of the world should shift for you. Just something to mull over until next time.
A brilliant and humbling reframing of the entire concept.
Thank you for joining us on this exploration of Surrounded by Idiots. Keep decoding those colors, and we will see you on the next deep dive.